Shalom, everybody. Welcome back. And I just want to go into a little more of what we discussed about yesterday. That Hashem, God, is really at the core of this whole Jewish perspective on life. And of course, it's necessary to discuss Hashem a little bit and understand what do we mean when we say God? Because when we refer to God in the future, we want to make sure that we have this straight. And as I mentioned, believing in one God does not mean believing in one as opposed to two or three gods. So I had an interesting conversation with an 8th grader recently, and he told me that he's an atheist. So I explained to him, wait a second, what does that mean that you're an atheist? It means that you don't believe in God. It doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. It means you've come to a conclusion, for whatever reason, that you don't believe and you don't really depend on God, you don't want to make God part of your life. But for purposes of intellectual honesty, just as you ask me to prove God's existence, and I can't sort of say, snap my fingers and show you that God exists, then you can't prove either that God does not exist. Because if we're going to make it an equal footing and a level playing field, then just as I can't prove, you can't prove. So really, to be an atheist doesn't really make sense. Because no atheist can prove that God does not exist. They can ignore God, they can live God differently without God in their lives. But as I explain often, whenever I get the question about the Holocaust or about any terrible things that happen in a person's life, and they say, well, how can I believe in God after experiencing this in my life, or after God did this, so to say? And the answer to me is very simple. I tell them it's like comparing apples and oranges. What does that mean? The Torah says, "Bereshit bara Elokim es hashamayim v'haaretz." In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So God right there was presenting his credentials. This is who I am. This is the very first sentence of the Torah. This is Hashem's introduction to himself. Now, decide on that basis, can the world exist without there being an intelligence behind it, without there being a designer, an engineer, a creator who's creating it and bringing it into being? And if a person comes somehow to some conclusion that it's perfectly okay that the world came into being just by coincidence after coincidence after coincidence and just happened to fall into place the way it is today, then such a person could sort of say not believe that God exists. Even though according to some who claim that the world could be created without there being a God, doesn't mean that God doesn't exist, even according to their theology or their perspective of science. So when God created that initial part of his resume, everything after that is a matter of, well, do I like the job that God is doing or I don't like that job? Nobody would say about their parents, if their parents were the worst people in the world, they were abusive, they did everything wrong in the books that you could possibly imagine. A child who grew up in such a home would not say later on in life, if asked, how are your parents, or tell me about your parents, they wouldn't say, I never had parents, my parents didn't exist. They might complain, and they might even say that they don't like their parents or don't respect their parents, so they have no need for their parents. But they wouldn't say that their parents don't exist. So similarly, we also need to come to a conclusion. Can the world exist without there being a creator behind it, a force that's bringing it into being, a designer that created a hummingbird, or the feathers of a peacock, or the pouch of a kangaroo, or the brain of a person, even the eyes of a person? Each of those would require tens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of patents if we were to try to create them on their own. It would take a certain brilliance to create even one organ within the human body that we can't even imagine at this time and age, with all of our scientific advancements. So there's two different issues here. One is, does God exist or does God not exist? And then once, if we can come to a conclusion that yes, there must be some type of force, call it whatever name you want to call it, that brings this world into being and creates it to be what it is, then we have a legitimate question. Well, how come the world runs the way it runs? And how come things are the way they are? And how come this God is so hidden? So just to wrap things up a little bit, we're saying that to be an atheist really isn't intellectually honest, because it's not playing with a fair or a level playing field. And then to come to a conclusion about whether or not God does exist or not on the basis of how God runs the world is also not fair, because they're two different issues. Now, how God runs the world is truly a question. Why is God so hidden? Why do so many negative things happen? Why are there such challenges and obstacles? Why is there such evil in the world? All of these things are questions that every single person has a legitimate right to ask. And if a person's been a victim of some of the negatives in life, they have a right to be angry at God, or to have a complaint to God, or have a dialogue with God, or ask, why did this happen to me? But God introduced himself by saying, Bereshit bara Elokim es hashamayim v'ha'aretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And what is the name of God that God himself uses in the Torah? So this is where Hasidut comes in to explain something very important. That the name Elokim is a name that is used in the first 32 times that the name God is referred to in the Torah. And the name Elokim has the same gematria as the word Hateva, nature. In other words, that Elokim represents that aspect of God that is totally enclosed into nature to hide God. God's intent in creation was to be totally hidden in this creation, not to push his way in, not to force his way of life, his perspective, his values, or his morals, because the creation took place in a way to create an environment where you and I and every human being would have a degree of free choice. If God was obvious in the world, and God was apparent, or every time I did a mitzvah, $5 would fall into my pocket, or I'd get a tingle or a nice feeling in my body, then what kind of free choice would we have? There would be none, because everybody would want to do good deeds and be close to God and believe in God, because there'd be immediate results. But God created the world in a way that he was deliberately hidden. So like in a relationship, it's very difficult having a relationship when one party is very hidden and wants to stay hidden. And that's where Hasidus comes in. Because even though God's intent is to be hidden, nevertheless, the potential for a relationship is very much there. It's not as if God is far off in the distance, away in the heavens. God is flowing godly, creative energy. God is flowing his love. God is flowing light into this world from moment to moment, from second to second. And as a result, we, in fact, are part of this oneness. We are, in fact, are part of this godliness that has all the tools for us to develop that relationship. We're not necessarily going to understand all about God. We're not going to understand everything that exists. We are this finite little speck compared to God's infinity. But the Torah, especially the way Hasidus opens our eyes to it, gives us the tools to be able to see how God's involvement in the world is so intense, is so personalized, and is so available. All we have to do sometimes is just scratch the surface, or at least to dig a little bit deeper, using our mind and using our heart, to be able to find out what it's all about and where this God is. So hopefully we'll continue to do that over the coming weeks and months. Take care, have a great Shabbos, and we should all be able to celebrate many good occasions together. Have a great day.